For this drawing tutorial, all you will need is a sketchbook and a fineliner pen. I am using a Copic Multiliner as well as my Stonehenge White pad, but you can use any fineliner in 0.03 or 0.05 and really any sketchbook that you'd like. I suggest going back and watching my previous drawing tutorials if you haven't already. I have lots of good ones on this page, but today we will be drawing clementines. So take out your pens and get your sketch pad ready and let's start drawing. As always, we're going to be starting with a very light outline of our object. We're going to be starting with the leaves of the clementine as though we have just taken it off of the tree where it's been growing. But you can see I'm applying very little pressure to the pen as I start with the leaf shape. I have a full tutorial on drawing leaves. If you haven't watched that already, definitely go back and see that first, and then come back to this tutorial. So I'm dividing the leaves in two with a middle vein down the center. Next, I'm going to be drawing the body of the fruit, so the actual clementine. This tutorial is a little bit quicker paced. You'll notice that I try to pick up the pace a little bit as we have more and more drawing experience. So if you find it's a little bit too quick, definitely go back to my previous tutorials first. For the clementine, we're not drawing a perfect circle because, like I always say, in nature, nothing is perfect. So instead, it's as though we made a clay ball, a clay sphere, and we kind of squished it a little bit in our hands. Not too much, but just enough that it's not a perfect circle. I'm drawing just a little bump up by the stem of the clementine, just to give it a little bit more detail. And then we're going to get ready to start the shading. So for the shading, remember, we always start light and we can always add layers of little pen strokes to make the shading darker. Keeping each individual shading line nice and close together so that we don't leave these awkward sort of choppy gaps between each shading line. And right now I'm just doing the stem. I'm just very lightly shading one side of the stem to give the idea of a shadow and emphasize that slight bend. You can see where I'm starting to go in a little bit darker. I'm always going back and forth between different sections of the clementine stem or the leaf, wherever I'm working on, if I think that I have to add a little bit more shadow. And now it's time to start on the body of the clementine. So I'm going to start by paying attention to this part just under the leaf. The leaf, of course, is casting a shadow on the clementine. So I want it to be darkest, or one of the darkest sections of the clementine where the shadow would lay. My pen strokes are short, but not too short. Enough that they sort of bend with the, long enough that they sort of bend with the shape of the clementine. And they're not short, choppy lines like I always say we don't want, because that will make our shading look very separated, very unnatural. If we have our lines nice and close together and bending in the shape of our object, which in this case is the clementine, then we'll get a much more natural sort of flowing shading. So I'm going to slowly shade around the clementine. It's going to be darkest, in addition to where the leaf sort of casts that shadow, it's also going to be darkest around the edges. This will help give the idea of a very sort of rounded object, which of course is our clementine. But once again, it's not perfectly round. If you want to practice off to the side of your sketchbook, you can always draw a perfect circle and practice shading from dark on the outer sides to the center, which will be lightest. But I find that going straight to the clementine definitely works as well. So I added in a little bit more of a shadow underneath the second leaf. You can see I'm going in both directions. I'm actually doing a little bit of cross hatching here, but still both ways that I'm cross hatching are curved. I'm not doing straight lines with lots of room between them. I'm doing lines that very much overlap and are connected for a consistent, smooth shading. Once I've added in the shadow over on this side, I'm going to continue the shading around the clementine. You'll notice that I'm adding in shadows sort of towards the center of the clementine as well, just to give the idea of bumps and sort of indents in the clementine peel, because of course they're not completely even. It's not perfectly from darkest to lightest, from the outside to the inside of the clementine. We still get bumps and ridges here and there, and I want to make sure I add those in. For this video, I'm using the Copic Multiliner. I use this pen and the Unipin Fineliner the most, and you'll notice that it has a really fine tip. It's really beautiful, draws very well, and I would definitely suggest this or the Unipin if you're looking to buy a new pen. I'm going to start layering my shading to make it a little bit darker as we go around. I want this shadow to be nice and dark and really pop out. And then I'm going to start shading along the bottom of the clementine. You can see I keep going back to attach it to different sections, different shading sections that I've already done. And then I sort of do a little bit more of an outline, but not so much that I can't blend it into my shading as I go in towards the center. You can see that I switch pen directions as well, and this just helps me get sort of a better angle on my drawing as I work around this round sort of clementine shape. So as I said before, the shading's not going to be completely even all the way around the clementine. You'll see that I go in a little bit further with darker shading in some sections. And that's just to sort of make the peel look a little bit more natural and have sort of those bumps and indents. And then I'm going in a little bit darker on the bottom already, so it looks as though that's the base of the clementine. I'm doing a fair amount of cross-hatching on this clementine, and that's to just give it the more rounded look. I find that this works best for an object this shape, that it really pulls it all together into one cohesive image. So this is a great tutorial because it can be applied to a bunch of different objects as well. It can be applied to all different fruits, so you could do lemons, you could do apples using these techniques, but you can also include it when you're drawing everyday objects. There's not really a limit to where you can take these shading techniques. And so if you think of a round object that you'd like to draw, you can actually go back to this tutorial and hopefully it will help you with a few of those drawing techniques. If you follow me on Instagram, you'll know that I always have my cats, Mindy and Panini, in my studio. So if you hear some purring in the background of this video, it's because Mindy is currently on my lap, just loving life and purring his little heart out. So this is the part of the tutorial where we really have to pay attention to how much shading we're putting in. You can see now I'm shading really towards the center, like right into the center, and pulling back out towards the outside. This is to give sort of a more dramatic shadow because of course you all know that I love really dramatic shadows in my drawings, and to give the clementine a little bit more depth. I'm being a little bit more careful around the top because I want to give it that idea of where the stem connects, and then going back into the bottom shadow and stretching it up towards the center. You can see how great the Copic Multiliner is for drawing light and adding in layers. I find that this pen you can start out super, super light and just slowly add on more and more layers. It's the same with the Unipin fine liner, which you all know I love as well. I find the Unipins a little bit easier to start out really dark with. If you want to instantly get that more dramatic shadow, well, the multi-liner, you really have to build it up. I absolutely love this stage of the drawing process. It's when the object you're drawing really starts to look like the object, but it still sort of needs those final touches that will bring it to life. So I kind of start going in from all different directions here, and this may be a little bit tricky to follow, but if you've watched my previous tutorials, hopefully you're getting to the point to where you can sort of assess your own drawing and see what it needs, whether it needs more shadows, whether you need to sort of back off on an area and let it be. But this is where you kind of have to start looking at your own piece and see where those shadows need more layers. One thing I always try to emphasize on my Instagram and YouTube channel is that you need to keep practicing. It's totally okay if you don't get this the first time, the 5th time, the 20th time. I've had hundreds and thousands of hours of drawing time and practice time, and I still mess up my drawings a fair amount. It takes time to get used to your pen, to your paper, to all the new techniques, and I can't emphasize enough that you should not give up. My drawings just 3 years ago look so different from my drawings today, and that's from constant and consistent practice. I'm doing so many layers here at the bottom. I really want my clementine to have that sort of idea of a rounded edges and of being a imperfect sphere. So I'm gonna keep doing more and more cross hatching and pressing a little bit harder on my pen, but not too hard, to create that sort of cohesive, smooth shading. At this point, you may be thinking, wow, she really just keeps going round and round that clementine. And I do, I really do. I'm hoping that if you've watched my previous tutorials, you may be at the point now where you can kind of assess your own drawings and see what else it needs. Your drawing's gonna look very different from mine. Mine's gonna look very different from yours, and that's totally okay. Everyone has such a unique style when it comes to fine liner pens. There's almost no way to completely copy what one person is doing, which is so great that we can all have our own styles. But this is where I want you to look at your clementine and decide how much more shading it needs. Okay, this is another part I really love. When the majority of the shading is done, I'm gonna go in and start adding in these little tiny almost dots, these little quick light strokes. And that's kind of the texture in the peel of the clementine. So you can see I'm not going in too dark. It's just kind of details on top of the shading. And it's these curved, tiny little lines. I'm gonna do the most around the outside because of course the highlight is in the center and you wouldn't be able to see them quite as clearly. And I'm just adding in more of these tiny little dents. You can see here how they're mainly concentrated in the shadows to make the shadows look even darker. And I'm actually even going back in at this point and adding in darker shadows and a little bit more detail. It's never ending, but that's okay. So adding in a little bit more shadows towards the center just to give it even more texture and a little bit of depth. I want that shadow to be a little bit longer. And we're slowly getting there. Okay, let's add in those final few textured dots on the peel for a little bit more detail. If you wanted to, you could probably spend one day on just a clementine, but I'm not gonna make you do that. So we're just finishing up these last little pieces, adding in more shadows, of course, and then it will be time to move on to the leaves. Like I said before, we're gonna be a little bit quicker with the leaves this time. I'm just gonna show you how to draw one, and then let you work on the second one alone. If you need another leaf tutorial, I have a really great one. I believe it's my second video, and it gives sort of a more in-depth look at how to draw leaves. Okay, let's start drawing this leaf together. So from the center line that we originally drew, out to the edges of the leaf, we're going to draw about 5-6 lines on each side on both of the leaves. So you can see they're curved, they're not straight. Definitely make sure those little lines that I'm drawing right now are curved. And you can see it already helps the leaves have their own shape. I'm going to start by shading these leaves one section at a time. I like to think of leaves are being made of all these little sections, and then therefore doing all the shading separately. The center of each section should be the lightest, whereas the edges should be the darkest. You can see I'm going in quite light at first, so thinking of all the shading techniques we've been practicing, having the shading line, each pen stroke overlapping. We can always add in more layers, and that we don't want any awkward gaps between our shading lines. And once you get the hang of this, it's super quick. You just keep going to each section, darkest to light to dark again around the edges, and your leaf will slowly start to take shape. At the end, you can always go around the outside of your leaf outline just to clean it up a bit. But remember, don't press too hard on that outline because we don't want it to stand out from the rest of your shading. We want the outline to be light enough that we can blend it into the shading. But you can still lightly go around the outline one more time to kind of clean up those edges. You'll notice I've left a little bit of space between. Here I am going back into the clementine again because I noticed a spot that I wanted a little bit more shadow, but you'll notice that I've left a little bit of space between each of those leaf sections and the middle as well. This is to make the veins of the leaf really pop out and have each section have its own sort of highlight or divide. Okay, I want you to try this leaf by yourself. If you need to go back to that section where we just worked on the leaf, or pause this and go back to my leaf tutorial, this is a good time. You can see darkest to lightest, leaving those little lines in between, and then we will have our full leaf finished. And I'm cleaning up the edges here as well. Now I just want to go back into my clementine, add in a few darker shadows to really make it pop out. And I'm actually adding in a shadow at the base too, which you don't have to do, but in this case, I wanted to because it really grounds the clementine. I'm just doing a little bit of cross hatching here to make the shadow a little bit darker around the base of the clementine and just kind of evening it out. You can see how it looks like the clementine's now sitting on like a table or a counter or somewhere. But you could also have it in a tree, or you could have it in a fruit basket. But definitely try applying these techniques to other objects as well, especially other fruit, because once you have the shape of the fruit done, when you have that outline finished, all of these techniques come in really handy no matter what kind of fruit it is. And of course, I'm going in one last time and darkening those shadows because I want that shading to be dramatic, to really pop out and instantly catch the viewer's eye when they see this drawing. And of course, to end this video, we will be signing our drawing. I will see you next time for our next drawing tutorial, but in the meantime, make sure you revisit all of the previous drawing tutorials if you haven't already to learn some really great fine liner tips and tricks.